This is Elyndorh. Gather, build, conquer. It used to barely run. Now, it barely runs, but with a few more systems. Since the last devlog, I rebuilt the workers from scratch, tore the entire building system apart and put it back together. Finally, taught my units how to actually walk without tripping over each other. And after way too long, the map finally has fog of war.
Damn!
Let's start with the workers. These little guys hold half the game together. Right now, they do two things: gather resources and build. Sounds simple, it was not. Here is how it works. Leave a worker alone and it goes looking for the nearest resource, walks over and starts gathering all on its own. Easy, right?
Wrong.
This took so long to get working, and honestly, it still barely does. Getting them to just walk up to a tree and stand in the right spot fought me for days. My workers needed to be able to build, but my building system was duct taped together and it was literally click to build. And the problem with that is that the player can just spam build buildings around the map without any strategy. And RTS games literally have strategy in their name. The way I fixed it is I deleted the whole system. It was painful, but worth it in the long run. The workers exist to build things, so I can't really explain them without the building system. To be able to build at the first place, you will need to have worker units selected. Select a building from the build menu, and then you can choose a place and place the building. While we are at the build menu is actually the thing that drives this system. It took me 3 or 4 days to get it working the way I wanted, but it was so worth it. I made it data-driven. What that means is that to add a new building, I just need to add a new slot in a data table, which is really easy with my current setup. Let me tell you what a data table slot requires. So this is the struct behind every building. One row in the data table and each field controls one thing about that building. Adding a whole new building is basically just filling this out. Let me walk you through it. The name of the building, pretty obviously, this is just what the building is called. Static mesh, this is the actual model that shows up in the world. Actor to spawn, the real building that gets placed on its build. The mesh above is just the kind for the preview. This is the finished thing. Mesh size, how big it is, which I use for placement so buildings take up the right footprint on the grid. Building icon, the little picture that shows up in the build menu, so you know what you are picking. Description, this is the description of the building. Structure subclass, this is how I categorize buildings. Block building, this is a simple boolean that tells the build menu if it should display the building. The build menu creates a build menu slot that will contain the building data. Underneath, clicking a slot calls an ability on the player, passes down the building data, and the building ability handles the rest. The tricky part was actually making the thing work for multiplayer, which in my case, those kind of problems take the most amount of time. When you place a building, it drops down as an empty construction site and pings one of your selected workers to come and build it. And building isn't instant. Each structure has 3 construction stages the worker has to work through one at a time. Here is how that works. Once a building's assigned, the worker heads over and gets to work. And I actually reused the whole resource gathering system for this. So it walks up and plays an animation based on the current construction stage. Every building has its own build time, and each stage tracks separately. Pull the worker away mid-stage and that stage's timer resets, but only that one, so you don't lose all your progress, and only one worker can build a structure at a time. Remember how I said getting a worker to just walk up to a tree fought me for days? Yeah, that's because none of this works without one massive system underneath it: pathfinding. So let's talk about how everything in Elyndorh actually gets from A to B. I started with what's called A-star pathfinding. It's the classic, it's reliable, but the problem I had was that it got slow when calculating bigger paths and when I had a lot of units selected. The way I fixed that was I turned my A-star system into HPA star system, which worked way better. It didn't just double my FPS when commanding units, it tripled it. The first version of my system moved in stiff, sharp lines, which I didn't really like, so I made another system on top, for smoothing the path. It brought some complexity to the code, but it didn't affect the performance at all, which I'm really happy about. While I was testing the pathfinding, I figured out that my previous coded formation algorithm wasn't what I liked. I was using traditional formations and they weren't dynamic. My idea was that I wanted to give the player a little control over the formations, like units per row and spacing. But further testing proved it wasn't practical for my game, so what I did was I deleted another system. I spent some time sketching and writing down ideas on paper for my formation algorithm, and I landed on this one. It took some time to code, it was tricky, but I managed to pull it off. Now the formation is calculated dynamically based on the location and the surroundings. My formation system job now is to keep the units together without any fixed positions. What I mean by that is I don't try to hold the positions of the units the same every time. Every time I command them to move, new positions for each unit are calculated. While I was coding the formation system, I was stuck in a problem where units would bump into each other and get stuck. At the time, I thought the problem was with my pathfinding or the formations. But after further testing and research, I found out that I needed to implement crowd simulation. I tried looking into Unreal's crowd simulation system, but because I had my own pathfinding system and I wanted full control over every setting, it didn't work for me. I ended up making Elyndorh's own crowd simulation system, which in my case also handles the movement of the units, so I can reuse my code anywhere. The result is what you are seeing here. Send a whole army somewhere and they part around each other and flow through instead of turning into a traffic jam. Now, this system can be worked on a lot more, but for now it's exactly what I need, and I'm really happy with how it turned out. At this stage, my units can move across the whole map without tripping over each other. One problem though, they could also see the whole map. No secrets, no scouting, nothing hidden. And for a RTS, that's a big deal, which brings me to the last thing I added, Fog of War. Fog of War is what hides the map until you actually explore it. Your units carve out vision as they move. Everything they haven't seen stays dark, and anything outside sight goes back into the fog, so an enemy could be massing an army right next to you and you'd have no idea. That's the tension it adds. That is exactly what the game was missing. Now, this system is still a work in progress, and here is why. It works, but it hits hard on performance. I built it to run mostly on the GPU, but the CPU still plays a big role, since it's the one sending over all the units and buildings locations. With a small number of units, it runs really well, but throw in a huge crowd and a ton of buildings and the CPU starts to struggle. I've already improved it by a lot, but it's still not where I want it to be. The other headache was the units themselves, especially the workers. None of them were coded with a fog of war in mind, so a bunch of things quietly broke. The workers were the worst. They'd happily pet toward resource they were never supposed to know existed yet. I had to go back and teach them to ignore anything still hidden in the fog. If a resource hasn't been discovered, it doesn't go into their search pool at all. For a system I put off for so long, I'm genuinely happy it's finally in. It makes the whole game feel more alive, and honestly, a bit more tense. It's not perfect yet, but it's a huge step, and I'll keep improving it. And that's where Elyndorh is at right now. Workers that build and gather, a proper building system, pathfinding that actually scales, units that move like a crowd instead of a traffic jam, and finally, Fog of War. There's still a mountain of stuff to do, and half of what I showed today still needs work. but it's come a long way, and I'm happy with where it's heading. If you want to follow along, the best thing you can do is wishlist Elyndorh on Steam. It genuinely helps more than you'd think. And subscribe so you don't miss the next devlog.